Hello, my name is Constant Brand. I'm from the European Environment Agency's press office, and welcome to another edition of the EEA's Ask an Expert discussion series. Today we are discussing transport, and we are discussing it with our transport expert, Andreas Unterstaller. Andreas, can you hear me? You can, just turn on your video.
Hi,
there
Constant.
We are.
How are you doing? Good to see
How
you.
Are you? Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you.
So today we're discussing our latest assessments on transport and the environment, and how can we choose the greenest transport options, which are discussed, as well as sustainable mobility in the report and the briefing, which were published just a few weeks ago. Andreas, I guess to start our discussion today, and just before I start, before I forget, welcome to all our viewers. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to jot them down in the comment section after our opening discussion. If you have questions for Andreas, please feel free to ask them. I'll be more than happy to answer them for you today. And we'll also post links to the report and the briefing in our discussion today as well. Andreas, just to start off, what area do you work on within the agency?
So my topics are transport and environment, and my work is focused on three questions mainly. The first question is, where do we stand? This is about identifying the starting point. We collect data and provide analysis on the sustainability of the mobility system and the different modes of transport. The briefing we put out on the CO2 efficiency of different transport modes, for example, falls into this category. The second question is, how is the EU doing on its environmental and climate objectives? So this is about measuring progress. To do so, we monitor the emissions for cars, vans, and trucks, for example, and the share of renewable energy in transport, and we compare them to the relevant EU targets. The third question is, how can we make the mobility system more sustainable? So here we are trying to identify the most promising pathways towards sustainable transport. Our train or plane report, for example, falls into this category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and indeed. And what are the main issues when it comes to transport, environment, and climate?
I think everyone is aware of the climate impact of transport. Transport is responsible for about a quarter of the EU's total greenhouse gas emissions, so it is a very important contributor to climate change. Transport also has important health impacts. Most of all, these come from air pollution, but there's also pollution to water and to soil from transport activities. Noise pollution is also very important in this context, especially for health. Finally, there's the pressure from transport on natural habitats, on ecosystems, on animals, on plants. This is linked to transport infrastructure mainly, the land the infrastructure uses and the areas it's cut through.
So definitely it touches on all sorts of aspects on the environment. It's good to put that context in before we talk about the report, and which segues to the next question. We recently published the report and the briefing, and first on the report, on the Transport and Environment report, can you explain a bit its findings? Of course, the title is right behind you as well, and behind me.
Our annual Transport and Environment report analyzes a different topic every year. And the latest one looks at the environmental pressures from rail and air travel in the European Union. It covers the complete range of impacts and quantifies emission costs for door-to-door trips for 20 concrete city pairs in the European Union. We also calculated the emission costs for travel by car as a reference point, because this is the dominant mode of passenger travel in Europe. The report also summarizes the policies in the EU and internationally that influence the environmental performance of rail and air transport. The findings are not entirely surprising, many will say, but nonetheless, we think they're very useful. When we look at rail and air passenger travel, rail transport is clearly the better choice in terms of emission costs. So this is a very clear finding there. And this applies to all of the 20 city pairs that we looked at. There are a few aspects that might be surprising to some, however. For example, going on a long distance trip alone in a petrol or diesel car can be a really bad choice for the environment, even compared to flying.
So basically, the car is more environmentally unfriendly overall, based on all the research done.
No,
No.
This wouldn't be the right conclusion. Sorry, I think it really depends on the concrete circumstances, and I think the emphasis.
That's what I wanted to highlight, because
I know, and the
there's a lot of
emphasis
different circumstances involved.
Is on traveling alone in a car. So the report analyzes both kind of single person car travel, which is not that far from reality, because the average occupancy is somewhere 1.6, 1.7. And then we're also looking at a scenario where 4 people travel in a car. So basically a full car, or 80% full car. And that makes an enormous difference. And it's also not an unusual scenario for long distance trips. This would be like a family holiday, for example.
Sure. Yeah, indeed, that makes sense. And can you also explain a little bit about the briefing that we also released?
Yeah, so there are 2 products that we basically released at the same time. And the briefing looks at the average greenhouse gas efficiency of the different modes of motorized transport in the EU. So the question is, how much CO2 is emitted per person and kilometer traveled, or alternatively for moving 1 ton of freight over 1 kilometer. So it covers passenger and freight transport by road, air, rail, and water. And it builds averages on the basis of the available statistical data that we have. So the values are not for concrete trips. It's not something you would use to calculate, the emissions of your trips by just multiplying the kilometers, because it's really context specific. One conclusion is that we have an enormous range here between the best and the worst performing modes of transport. Rail and water transport being typically the lowest in terms of emission, and air and road transport typically much higher. Coaches and buses are a bit of an exception, as they are also a very efficient form of passenger transport. And those 2 we lump together. So coaches probably perform a bit better, and buses a bit worse, because they're used for different purposes and have different typical occupancy rates and so on. But the background report kind of gives a lot of more detail, and people should really look at that if they're interested in that detail.
Yeah, there's an interesting comparison in both, and my colleagues will post the links to the briefing and the report down below in the comments section. Again, if you have any questions or comments for Andreas, please post them below, and we will be sure to get to them. I mean, it's probably worth stating that not all these modes are perfect or completely pollution-free, but I mean, the best, the greenest, is still walking and cycling.
Yes, absolutely.
Where we can, certainly, and we've discussed this in previous years and previous transport environment reports, we would look at urban mobility and so forth, where we should really be looking at walking and public transport and cycling where we can.
Yes, if that's a viable choice, if you can do that, that's by far the best thing you can do for the environment.
I guess the next question is, what can transport be truly sustainable? I mean, what would it take to get us there? And what about electric cars now, which are increasingly becoming viable, whatever, noticeable on our streets?
Yeah, we're seeing more and more of them around us. At the same time, I want to say that the discourse on this is often very, very technology focused. So we're talking like we're doing now about electric cars and about hydrogen planes and so on. And yes, all of that can make a difference, but we need to think beyond fixing environmental problems solely with technology. And we need to aim for systemic improvement, because there is no car or plane or train that is 100% clean, and that would solve all of our environmental problems when we look at the full range of environmental impacts.
And obviously we can't be banning one form or the other. That just makes no sense. So what kind of targets and policies has Europe put in place on this?
Loads has happened during the last 18 months or so. With the European Green Deal, we now have a European strategy that really puts environmental sustainability and climate protection at the heart of the political agenda. The headline goal for transport is a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 compared to 1990. So this is kind of a massive reduction we're looking at. In addition, and with the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy that was published in December last year, we now also have a strategy that translates the ambition of the Green Deal into detailed targets and concrete actions for transport. In addition, we also have the zero pollution ambition of the Green Deal and the zero pollution action plan that is forthcoming. And that also applies to transport, because it's not, let's say, climate protection is not the alpha and omega, of things. It's very important, it's central, but it's not the only thing. Also, wider pollution, health, biodiversity aspects are very important.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in this field, and I'm sure a lot too. We're already getting a question, and actually one from Eleftheria. Thank you. She beat me to it on COVID-19's impact, which I was just going to ask you about. How did COVID-19 impact mobility patterns and transport? How did it impact mobility patterns and transport demand? Sorry.
The super relevant question. We do not have complete data for last year yet, but it is clear that passenger traffic went down strongly, especially for international air and rail travel, and also for public transport. Freight transport, in contrast, has been much less affected by the pandemic. Active mobility seems to have increased as people took to walking and cycling increasingly, which is a safe, healthy, and sustainable choice also during times of pandemic. One worry we have is that we might see a resurgence of car use and car dependency because people feel safer in their cars in the current circumstances. And that would really be kind of a step back in terms of sustainability if these patterns take hold over time. It's quite important to get people back to public transport, to shared forms of transport, and ensure they're safe and communicate there are safe choices.
And will we know by next year, perhaps, how will we have some more data on this by next year, you think, on next year?
Absolutely. There is an annual cycle of statistics, which is quite detailed, quite reliable, but as a result, not the quickest, and there will be much better data also on the CO2 emissions from transport during 2020, which will also have decreased, and we are hoping that this can be turned into a lasting trend of decreasing emissions, and we won't just see an uptick again as soon as the restrictions get lifted.
Vis-a-vis all the other pollution that we have, how big is transport related to the other emissions that we have to deal with?
When talking about greenhouse gas emissions and the European Union, it's about a quarter. When we're talking about air pollution, it kind of really depends on the pollutant in question. It can be quite a high share, for example, for particulate matter or for NOx. For other pollutants, it's not that high. So here it's really more specific, but it's a major contributor to both climate change and to air pollution.
Okay. Right, thanks. We're getting more questions in. Again, if you have questions or comments, please post them down below and we'll get to them. Next question is from Sylvia Kosova. Can we talk about the environmental impact of electric vehicles manufacturing?
Yes, very happy to do that, because that's what we wrote our Transport and Environment report. Was it 2 years ago? I think
it was 2 years ago,
yes, so we looked at the life cycle impacts of electric cars and also from a circular economy perspective. And this is an important way of looking at electromobility, because there's more than just the direct kind of emissions from cars, from vehicles in general. We also need to look at the production of vehicles, which starts with the extraction of raw materials and their processing, and then putting everything together in an electric car, for example, making the batteries. And then we have the use phase, when the car is driven around for a number of years and is repaired and maintained and so on, and parts are exchanged. And then we have the end of life phase, which includes reuse, recycling, and scrappage, basically. And all of this, in principle, if you want to have a complete picture, needs to be added up across environmental impacts categories. And for electric cars, we see much less of a negative impact during the use phase, but an increased impact, especially during the production phase.
And what about is the aim to recycle the batteries or reuse the vehicle batteries at all, or?
Yeah, this is really starting to as a major topic. Also, kind of, we have initiatives there. There's kind of rules and standards being developed in this area to enable the efficient recycling of batteries, and not just the recycling, also the reuse, the manufacturing, which is a better choice as long as that is possible, for batteries to be used in stationary energy storage, for example. So these are all ways of improving the overall life cycle impacts, and this is an important line to follow.
Okay. Another question from Rasmus. I'm not sure how much we can say on this. Will the US be more likely to follow suit now? Is pressure being applied? Well, as far as the EEA, we're not a political actor, so we can't directly answer to that. But how far is the data and that we're collecting as seen as a model by other areas in the world? Do you know at all on transport?
I think there's a lot of interest in what we do. We're trying to be in a dialogue with international partners where this is seen as useful, also in areas where we can learn something, of course. With the US, we've just been engaging in a dialogue at a working level on the resilience and adaptation of transport in a climate change context. So there's a lot happening there, and it's really nice to see there's maybe added dynamic and interest in that field.
Okay. Next question from Marios. What about all the transport that is linked to online shopping? Can we see any trends? Instead of people going to shops, the goods being delivered to people's homes?
Another super relevant question. No definite answer to that, unfortunately. Well, the thing is, it's of course great if you can have things delivered at home, but it doesn't mean there are no environmental costs if we replace our trip to the shop or to the store with a delivery to our house. So the whole logistics chain basically looks different for e-commerce and has different impacts. And there are a number of studies out there for very concrete cases comparing the impacts, but there's no definite answer yet how they compare in terms of the environment. And this is something that definitely we need to have an eye on, and that will probably follow up in our future work.
And it's certainly something also related to the COVID era, of course, where everybody stayed at home and lots of people were shopping online and so forth, getting the supplies and groceries and so forth. So definitely something
there's a general trend there. People have adopted different habits, and these will have a lasting effect. There's more working from home, there's less business travel, there's more shopping from home, and this has an impact on transport, and therefore also has an impact on the environment. And we still need to see what exactly that will look like, and that's a super exciting area of research.
We talked briefly about the data, but perhaps you could go into more detail. What data are we exactly looking at when we put these reports together and study this stuff?
So when we're looking at a rather broad report, like a transport and environment report on train or plane, looking at a variety of data sources, we always try to put our own data at the center of our work, because that's what we have the best access to. It's what we are trying to valorize. And then we complement it with data from other sources, from other organizations, from scientific articles, and so on and so forth, to create a complete picture of the situation. Yeah. So some of the core data we are working with is from our greenhouse gas inventory, which includes the different modes of transport at a certain level of detail, which is basically overall collection of greenhouse gas data in the EU, which we link then to the international level and to the UN processes in this area.
Okay, and then what happens to these reports now? I'm assuming the policymakers in European level and national level will have a close look at this as well.
Yeah, I mean, we are really trying to put our reports to the best use, and that can only happen if they are being recognized and studied, also scrutinized, also criticized. Is all part of the process. This makes our own work better, and that's how we contribute to other people's work. That's how we are also hoping to contribute to policy. And as some might have heard, 2021 is the European Year of Rail. So there's really a push to talk about rail, to develop policy in this field, to realize the sustainability contribution that rail transport can make. So I think we're hitting pretty much the right spot with the report and with its timing.
We have another question from Peter van Veldhoven. How did you include non-CO2 effects on climate?
Okay. So here we are talking about the global warming contribution of aviation emissions that are not CO2 emissions. These are mainly nitrogen oxides, black carbon, and water vapor. And like CO2, these emissions also contribute to trapping heat in the atmosphere when they are emitted at high altitude. And here we had a different approach for the train or plane report and for the briefing. For train or plane, we applied a low, medium, and a high impact scenario using different multipliers because that is sort of a respected method of doing it, also for acknowledging the uncertainty involved. So you'll see these error bars when you look at the report that signify, show this range of possible impacts. For the briefing, we applied a factor of 1.7, which is taken from a very recent report that the European Aviation Safety Agency wrote for the European Commission. It takes stock of the latest science in the field. And we consulted on that and decided that the 1.7 factor, which stands for 100-year perspective and makes it comparable to CO2 impacts, is the best one we could apply here. But as said, this is an evolving field, and we are very transparent about our assumptions, and everyone is kind of invited to scrutinize them, to have their own views, maybe even make their own calculations if they want to. But we felt it's very important to include these effects because they're too prominent to just leave aside and not put, into the same figure at least.
Yeah. And I guess a key question that I would have, and I think a lot of people would have, is what can I do? Should I mean, now, of course, we can't travel much these days, but looking ahead, how do we assess to take the greenest mode of transport? Let's say if we're going on a holiday across a border, what can citizens do?
Quite a lot. I mean, we make choices every day that affect the environment. Our choices as transport users and as consumers really matter. And here it is important that people have an accurate idea of how their choices affect the environment. And that is one of the reasons why we make reports such as train or plane. At the same time, sustainability is not just a challenge for individual consumers, I think, and for transport users. It is also a challenge for society, and we as citizens can also play a role there and ask for the kind of change we want to see. And this applies all the way from the local to the international level. And I think we are really trying to inform people on their choices, on environmental impacts, and that is the role we want to play.
Another thing that just popped back to my head is about the efficiency gains you mentioned in the report and the briefing about all the modes of transport over the past few years. Can you explain a bit about that? Efficiency gains by aviation and in cars, for instance.
So this is something that comes from the briefing and the background report to the briefing, not from the train or plane report to the same extent. That's more of a snapshot. So especially rail travel and air travel, that's what our data tells us, got more efficient over the last few years. And for air travel, that's mostly related to a renewal of the fleet. It's kind of more efficient aircraft, especially more efficient aircraft engines. For rail transport, it mainly comes from the ongoing process of electrifying this form of transport, which is kind of more energy efficient than diesel trains.
Yeah.
However, we don't quite see the same progress, or sometimes no progress, for other modes of transport. I mean, road transport in our data seems to be pretty stagnant in terms of its average energy consumption and CO2 emissions. So this is kind of a differentiated picture here.
Okay, and I guess a lot of people also have a concern about noise pollution indirectly. You talk about that as far as concern vis-a-vis trains, rail, and aviation. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, as said, this is something you shouldn't overlook by just talking about air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. So almost all transport has kind of an effect on noise and noise pollution. Especially road transport is a very big source of noise, because we have a very dense network of road transport infrastructure that really reaches into towns and cities and affects a lot of people. Therefore, so the highest costs in terms of noise pollution are clearly from road transport. Also, rail transport has a role here, because we also have a dense network and people living within the vicinity of rail transport infrastructure, which is not as dense as road transport, so also affected by that. And this needs to be managed with different kinds of measures to mitigate the effects or to avoid the noise altogether. Everyone who lives around the airport knows aviation also has these effects. However, these are kind of more concentrated on around the areas of airports, and therefore maybe less prominent in total than for the other modes.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point to make as well. We have another question from Eleftheria. What about different types of fuels? To achieve sustainability, will aviation or shipping need some sort of cleaner fuels?
Switching to cleaner fuels is one of the key kind of steps we need to make in order to make transport more climate friendly, basically. So for aviation, it is probably the best available solution in the short to medium term, because it's decarbonizing aviation is really challenging because of the physics of aviation and also the energy density that it demands from a fuel. So switching to fuels such as sustainable aviation fuels, in the future also fuels such as hydrogen, including electrifying transport, at least kind of smaller planes, are important steps. And for maritime transport, maybe looking at a different set of fuels in a different situation, because the constraints are less prominent technically, but at the same time, it's a major sector with huge transport volumes. It also kind of has some challenges when it comes to switching to cleaner fuels, but it's definitely one of the key activities in this area.
And we're running out of time, but I'll just take one more question from Todd. How can national authorities shape mobility behavior? Do you know any good examples?
I think what I really would like to bring up is the role of authorities at the different level in kind of land use planning, in transport planning and urban planning, and integrating that and making sure it works for people, so that it enables sustainable mobility, that it provides accessibility without people having to make long and far trips by car, for example. Yeah. So if authorities focus on this area, I think that's really a huge contribution they can make, maybe not in a super short term, but in the medium to long term, and make sure that our cities and also kind of rural areas develop in ways that makes it possible for people to engage, to kind of use sustainable transport.
Yeah, indeed. And it goes back to what we can all do. We're going to wrap up now because we're out of time, but perhaps you can give us a sneak peek at what we're focusing on next after electric cars and trains and planes. Do you know what you will analyze next?
It's an exciting question. Yeah, we're looking into too. I think we might start looking into the challenge involved in kind of getting the road transport sector on a trajectory towards decarbonization, because this is still the biggest contributor in terms of the overall greenhouse gas emissions.
Excellent. Watch this space. Thank you very much, Andreas, for joining us. And thank you to our viewers as well, and your comments and questions today. Again, if you have any comments on our series, please feel free to jot them down and see how we're doing. And we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.